price.
Over 70% of our hogs are exported. If we lose an export market, it causes disaster in the price. So this is fabulous news, fabulous news.
Everybody will be celebrating tonight, I'm sure. Yeah, wonderful.
Tons of American beef are now sitting in cold storage with no buyers while on supermarket shelves. The price per pound keeps creeping up. So what happened? How did Asia turn its back on U.S. beef in just a few weeks, clearing the way for Canada to step in? And why are American shoppers paying more, even as farmers are taking heavy losses? In 2025, American beef is quietly being pushed off the menu across Asia, especially in key markets like Japan and South Korea, which together accounted for nearly 60% of total U.S. beef exports last year. According to the USDA, exports to China and Hong Kong are down a staggering 67.7% year over year. Japan and South Korea have also scaled back orders significantly. In March alone, weekly beef exports to Asia dropped to just over 50 tons, the lowest in years. While the U.S. scrambles, Canada is moving quickly to fill the gap. With a more modern logistics system, upgraded cold storage facilities, and strong source tracking policies, Canadian beef is emerging as a preferred alternative. Campaigns like Raised Without Hormones and No Antibiotics ever line up with increasingly strict standards in Asia, especially in Japan and South Korea, where food safety and transparency are major selling points. For American shoppers, this global shift hits close to home. As international sales dry up, U.S. meat processors face tighter margins and less room to absorb costs. Meanwhile, more Canadian beef is coming into American supermarkets at a higher price. That box of steaks that used to cost $40, it might now be $46 and climbing. Over the past 5 years, Canada has quietly poured hundreds of millions into upgrading its beef supply chain from ranch to retail. Ports like Vancouver and Prince Rupert have been expanded to handle frozen goods more efficiently. Cold storage hubs in Alberta and Saskatchewan now feature precision temperature systems to protect quality during global shipping. Canada Beef, the industry's marketing arm, rolled out a traceability program allowing each cut of meat to be traced back to its farm. Labels like Raised Without Hormones are now common on export packages. This makes it easier for Canadian beef to pass strict import inspections in Japan, South Korea, and Singapore markets that value food safety and hormone-free products. For Asian consumers, that means peace of mind without much extra cost. But for Americans, if this trend continues, it could hit domestic prices hard. One supermarket chain in California that used to buy U.S. beef at $6 per pound is now sourcing from Alberta at $7.20 per pound. That price difference gets passed right to you at checkout. American cattle ranchers are under growing pressure. According to the USDA, U.S. beef exports are projected to drop by nearly 10% in 2025, down to roughly 2.6 to 2.7 billion pounds. Meanwhile, imports are expected to rise 12%, topping 5 billion pounds mainly from Australia, New Zealand, and Brazil. Losing long-standing markets like Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam means more unsold product at home, and a glut that drives prices down for farmers, even as costs keep rising. Processing plants in Texas, Nebraska, and Kansas have cut back operations. Some have shut down temporarily, with hundreds of workers laid off. According to the American Meat Institute, small and mid-sized farms are losing buyers, forced to scale back or sell cattle early just to stay afloat. At the same time, prices at the grocery store keep rising. Ground beef now averages $6.10 per pound, over 10% more than it did at the start of the year. According to Food and Wine, if you used to spend $30 a week on ground beef, you might now be looking at $33 or $34. And while 2025 beef production is expected to hit 26.7 billion pounds, the breeding supply is falling, and feed costs are climbing. Feeder cattle are now priced at $281 per hundredweight, pushing production costs even higher.
Industry, businesses, Canadians, they are anxious, and they want the right kind of resolution. They want a deal that makes sense for Canada, that makes sense for Canadian business, for Canadian workers.
They used to deliver fresh milk every morning and form the rhythm of whole towns. But now, many small dairy farms in the U.S. are quietly shutting down. No protests, no headlines, just empty shelves where familiar milk used to be. Why did an industry that once saw 20% export growth end up with thousands of farmers losing their livelihood? What's really going on between the US, Canada, and Mexico that turned milk into a weapon in the silent trade chess game? In 2024, Mexico was the largest market for US dairy exports, making up nearly 1/3 of the total value by USDA data. Canada ranked second, but with barriers. Under Canada's supply management system, they impose quotas and harsh tariffs, sometimes near 298.5% on milk imports that exceed limits. A Cornell University study published in March 2025 says Canada has started some concessions to expand access for U.S. milk under USMCA, but so far only on paper, with no big changes in actual import volume. If you buy milk from Mexico or Canada today, you may soon see fewer options and rising prices. For example, a box of Mexican imported cheese that used to cost around $5 is now frequently priced near $6. Thanks to supply instability and shifting tariff rules, by Q1 2025, U.S. dairy exports reached about $714 million, up 20% from the year before. According to the Dairy Export Council, but volume rose just 0.4%, so most of that gain came from higher prices, not more milk shipped. Despite those figures, many small farms keep closing. In 2024 alone, 1,420 dairies shut down, about 5% of the total nationwide. Smaller farms are squeezed out by high production costs and limited market access, while large industrial farms survive thanks to automation and scale. If you live in regions like Wisconsin, Vermont, or Idaho, you may have noticed your local grocery store no longer stocks the fresh milk you used to buy at around $4.20 per gallon. Instead, you now see cheaper industrial versions for about $3.60, less consistent in taste and origin. A Café en Laconia, New Hampshire reported switching away from local organic milk, drawing customer complaints over flavor changes. In 2024, the U.S. produced over 226 billion pounds of milk, around 102 million tons, near historical highs. Average milk yield per cow is nearly 6 times what it was in the year 1924, showing how much mechanization has increased. The United States usually exports processed dairy products. Cheese worth $2.4 billion, non-fat dry milk valued at $2 billion, and lactose and whey totaling $1.9 billion rather than fresh or fluid milk. Canada operates a very different model. Through supply management, they set output ceilings, guarantee minimum prices for farmers, and slap heavy tariffs up to near 300% on any imports that exceed quotas. Farms are strictly regulated from feed and housing to final milk quality. This system has earned Canada strong trust among global buyers, including Mexico and European markets, despite a much smaller total volume than the US. For American consumers, that means it's easier to find inexpensive cheese and powdered milk, but much harder to get high-quality, imported fresh milk. Meanwhile, in Mexico, Canadian milk, though slightly more expensive, is often preferred for its consistency and traceable standards. This shift is making it harder for U.S. dairy farmers to compete and turning tariff policy into a double-edged sword.
With tariff talks top of mind, South Florida farmers say they're in trouble. Crops are rotting on the vine, and they're blaming the ongoing trade wars and immigration changes.
It all started with a tax order, just one government decision. And suddenly, the U.S. finds itself short on tomatoes and losing more than just produce. If your pizza seems more expensive lately, you're not imagining it. While Washington tightened the door on Mexico, Ottawa quietly opened theirs, and Canadian farmers are the ones cashing in. But behind the headlines and the multi-billion-dollar numbers are things that hit closer to home. Pricier ketchup, restaurant menus being trimmed, and everyday Americans footing the bill for a political move. What's really going on? Here's the picture. Starting July 14th, 2025, the U.S. Department of Commerce officially pulled out of its tomato trade suspension agreement with Mexico, imposing a 17% tariff on all fresh tomatoes coming in from our southern neighbor. The reason? To prevent underpricing and to support struggling farmers in Florida and Arizona. But there's a catch. Mexico supplies about 70% to 93% of the fresh tomatoes consumed in the U.S. So, this policy shift hit like a shockwave. If you usually buy a box of tomatoes for around $3, expect to see that jump to $3.30 or more within a few weeks. And it doesn't stop there. Pizza sauce, ketchup, salsa. These staples could all see price bumps. That burger or pizza slice you enjoy might soon cost an extra 50 cents to $1. 2. Canada moves in on the opportunity. While the US was closing the gate, Canada was busy rolling out the welcome mat. In July 2025, Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum met with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to announce a major expansion of their agricultural trade relationship. Mexico's cold chain logistics sector, critical for keeping produce fresh, hit $4 billion in value in 2024 and is expected to reach $6 billion by 2029. That's a solid base for tomato exports to grow fast. In the first half of 2025 alone, Canada pulled in $2.8 billion in tomato revenue, largely from rerouted Mexican supply. And with fewer trade hurdles, Canadian shoppers are getting top-quality Mexican tomatoes for around $2.50 a box, roughly 20 to 25% cheaper than what U.S. shoppers are paying at the same time. Pulling out of the Mexico agreement has led to real supply gaps in the U.S. Tomato prices are expected to rise another 6% to 10% by August 2025. Restaurants and food chains, Wendy's, Taco Bell, even household names like Heinz and DiGiorno are all rethinking their game plans. A 30 cc bottle of Heinz ketchup that used to cost $4.29 is now listed at $4.79 in major chains like Target and Walmart. Smaller restaurants are either raising prices or cutting back on tomatoes in their recipes. That means American diners are now directly feeling the impact of a trade policy that may have sounded distant, but now hits right on the dinner plate.
As we just heard, the U.S. president railed against Canadian dairy and lumber industries, claiming the U.S. is being, quote, ripped off.
Once a symbol of American agriculture, the dairy industry now falters right at home. Rather than being shipped off to Europe, Asia, or premium supermarkets, American milk is being dumped near unused farms. Meanwhile, Canada speaks softly but acts decisively and is quietly capturing global market share. Since mid-2025, Canada slapped import duties as high as 300% on U.S. milk that exceeds a small quota under its supply management system designed to protect domestic producers. As a result, over 90% of American milk exported to Canada has been halted. Trucks of U.S. milk have turned back, leaving millions of liters stuck in cold storage in states like Wisconsin, Vermont, and Idaho. Despite falling prices down over 30% in July, demand vanished as consumers grew wary or dismissed it as returned surplus. If you've seen 1-gallon cartons of whole milk drop from $4.20 to $2.90 at stores like Walmart or Kroger, that's not good news. It's a sign that the market is in crisis. With exports to Canada blocked, U.S. dairy entered a downward spiral. Production continued, but buyers disappeared. According to USDA, nearly 1,700 smaller dairy farms risked closure in Q2 2025. America once held 18% of the global dairy market, but by mid-2025, that plunged to under 9%, a two-decade low. This crisis goes beyond farmers. Rural communities that rely on dairy are feeling the pinch. Schools cutting lunches, local stores left empty, banks tightening credit, and jobs vanishing. If you once lived in a small town anchored by a dairy plant, now you may see that plant shuttered, hiring signs removed, and an entire community in limbo. It's not just Canada. Key global partners are turning away U.S. dairy. The European Union added U.S. milk to a retaliatory tariff list, covering $72 billion in exports. Japan and Australia tightened import standards, starting June 2025. The issue isn't quality, it's labeling transparency. Many countries require clear disclosure of growth hormone, RBST, antibiotic use, or farm source labels not mandatory in the U.S. Trucks of milk and cheese are being returned. Much of this excess supply is sold domestically at deep discounts, 1 gallon for as low as $1.80 instead of $3.50. But the real cost is trust. Americans are asking, if others won't buy this milk, what's in it? Confidence in the U.S. dairy industry is eroding. While the U.S. grapples with oversupply and trade retaliation, Canada quietly expands its global dairy footprint through solid planning, supply control, and farm support. Its supply management system limits oversupply, bans growth hormones and excess antibiotics, and ensures full traceability from farm to table. Exported Canadian dairy clearly states these standards, which many importing countries now expect. As a result, Canada has gained market share in Japan, South Korea, the EU, and even the Middle East. Canadian dairy export revenues surpassed 4.2 billion Canadian dollars in the first half of 2025, up nearly 18% from the same period in 2024. While U.S. families shop for those discounted cheese packs or milk jugs, they may not realize local dairy farmers are shutting operations, halting milking, or selling off farms. If this continues, the U.S. dairy sector faces more than lost markets. It risks losing the next generation of farmers once raised on its own family milk.